All right, welcome back to the FITSNews studios. Another edition of your Week in Review. A huge week on the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga front. A big hearing in Richland County, South Carolina, related to the first juror testifying about the jury tampering allegations that could give Alec Murdaugh a new trial. We're going to walk you through everything that happened in that Richland County courtroom that we're able to. A little interesting twist this time. We'll walk you through that twist in our first segment. We're also going to go through a big judicial reform issue raised by a South Carolina senator who is standing up against the failed status quo and insisting on real reform before any more judges are elected. Last but not least, I'm going to sit down again with Dylan Nolan, one of my favorite parts of the show, our political back and forth. We're going to walk you through the very latest in the 2024 presidential election and its impact here in South Carolina, which is the next primary on the presidential schedule. All that and more heading your way on the Week in Review. So obviously this week we are starting with the Murdaughs, a story that simply will not quit. This is something we've been following now for the better part of the last 3 years. This story continues taking twists and turns that no one saw coming. And I wanted to remind our audience as we begin this segment, be sure to tune in tomorrow night, Sunday at 6 p.m. right here for a live Q&A on the eve of the big evidentiary hearing where we will determine whether or not Alec Murdaugh receives a new trial. We may already know the answer at this point, which, by the way, is not the answer we thought it was going to be just a few weeks ago. We're going to walk you through all that on this show, but be sure again to tune in tomorrow night, 6 p.m. right here for a live Q&A on the big evidentiary hearing scheduled for this coming Monday. But how to unpack this week? It was an absolutely insane week on the Murdaugh story, one that, again, the twists and turns we talked about earlier, but this one took a turn I never saw coming and something that I've never seen in my years as a reporter, as a journalist covering the court system here in South Carolina. Let me try and walk you through what happened. As we all know, the evidentiary hearing that's scheduled to begin this coming Monday, January 29, 2024, in Richland County Courthouse, downtown Columbia, South Carolina, is going to feature testimony from all 12 of the jurors in Alec Murdaugh's trial. It's also going to feature testimony from the clerk of court in Colleton County, Becky Hill, who has been accused of tampering with that jury. So we all knew that that was coming up, but a wrinkle was thrown this week. One of the jurors, the former foreperson apparently, was part of a Bible group that apparently is going on a cruise of some sort, and so arrangements were made by the court to have this particular juror testify at the Richland County Courthouse Friday, yesterday. Now, I attended that hearing, and I've got to tell you, this is one of the most bizarre situations I've ever encountered, again, as a reporter covering this case, covering any case, really. Let me walk you through what happened. This juror, number 826, appeared at the court and was questioned by former Chief Justice Jean Toll, who is the judge empowered to hear Alec Murdaugh's motion for a new trial. What did Justice Toll ask the juror, and how did the juror respond? I'd love to tell you, but guess what? That's embargoed. You heard me right, embargoed. Now, prior to this hearing taking place, the former Chief Justice, came out and spoke to members of the media and asked them for a favor, a very big favor. Toll specifically asked all the members of the media covering the Murdaugh trial to refrain from publishing her questions of this particular juror and the juror's answers. The reason? Justice Toll did not want those answers to potentially prejudice the other jurors who, according to her, have been, quote, assiduously following this case, like the rest of us. Apparently there's Murdaugh junkies out there, but these jurors have been watching shows like ours. They've been reading news reports. They've been following the story incredibly closely. And according to Justice Toll, hearing this juror's answers could potentially impact their thinking about it and prejudice their answers, perhaps. Now, don't really understand that, but I wanted to address that request on a couple levels. Number one, does the former Chief Justice have any right to impose such a rule? No, she does not. Let's make that very clear. And in fact, she did not issue an order. There was no order. It was simply a verbal request to the members of the media. And I think the reason that an order was not issued is because such an order would represent on its face prior restraint of speech, which is, again, a violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. So there's no way that she can order members of the media not to report on what they saw. She can ask, she can't order. Now, after some deliberation, after consultation with our attorneys, we made the editorial decision to accept the terms of that embargo. And I want to tell you why. While I don't agree with it, while I think this could have been handled far better, starting with not making exceptions for any jurors because of their schedules, for a start, I agree to this embargo because I do see where Justice Toll is coming from. I do believe that there's the potential for this testimony to be twisted, to be distorted, to be portrayed in a manner inaccurately or misleadingly or with an agenda, because God knows there's some folks pushing agendas in this case. But I understand where she's coming from. She doesn't want it to adversely impact the integrity of the proceedings. And so that is why we as a news outlet decided to, again, accept the terms of that embargo and not publish what we heard in the Richland County courtroom on Friday. But there's another part of this that's very interesting. And there's a part of this that I wanted to address because it goes, again, to the very heart of what are we doing here? What are we looking for here? What is our job here? Is our job here to actually seek the truth about this story, or is our job to safeguard and secure a verdict at all costs? And I wanted to dive into that because there are some allegations that have been made, particularly involving this juror. And in fact, on the day of the hearing, just yesterday, Anjanette Levy, an incredibly respected reporter from the Law and Crime Network, posted on her Twitter account that this particular juror was engaged in one-on-one conversations with Becky Hill, and that after those conversations, Hill informed Levy and several others that a verdict would be coming the very next day. So very interesting to see that sort of level of interaction which was alleged. And again, I would love right now to speak to the question and answer of this particular juror. But again, I am going to abide by the embargo. We will, on Monday, once that embargo is lifted, be able to tell you more about that particular situation. But it is not a good look for the court. It is not a good look for this case. And it flows into the other thing I want to talk about as it relates to the Murdaugh saga this week. We broke a huge story 2 days before the big hearing on Friday about Becky Hill being prepped for this upcoming hearing by prosecutors for the state of South Carolina. We reported on a meeting that lasted a little over 3 hours. Apparently there were additional conversations because lead prosecutor Creighton Waters admitted in court on Friday, part of the proceedings we are allowed to talk about, that yes, the state spent significant time, 6 hours according to him, prepping Becky Hill. Let me walk you through why this is terrible on so many levels. This is an agency that, as of this airing, as of the moment we are airing this show, has prosecutorial authority over Becky Hill. They are literally tasked with determining whether or not, on the basis of an investigation by the State Law Enforcement Division, whether or not Becky Hill broke the law by tampering with the jury and exploiting her office for personal gain. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. They are tasked with deciding whether or not to prosecute her, while at the same time prepping her for hours as the star witness in a hearing to uphold the verdicts against Alec Murdaugh. Similarly, SLED, the State Law Enforcement Division, which was the lead investigatory agency on all of the Murdaugh cases, they are the ones investigating the jury tampering. And as Alec Murdaugh's attorney Dick Harpootlian pointed out in court, a little bit politically incorrect, there's no Chinese wall, he said. There's no separation between the agents on that case and the agents that are investigating the jury tampering allegations. And in fact, as we mentioned on several shows ago, there have been reports that SLED had been trying to steer some of the allegations involving Becky Hill's family members away from the jury tampering. Now, Creighton Waters claimed in court, Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor for the state, claimed that the investigation being done by SLED and the AG's office into the jury tampering investigation was being done with independence and integrity. He specifically said that they are not putting their thumb on the scale. And he said that the agents were told to find the facts, good, bad, and ugly. I want to believe that. I believe the Attorney General of South Carolina, Alan Wilson, is a man of integrity. I believe Mark Keel, the chief of the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division, is a man of integrity. We got some big disagreements on medical marijuana and other issues and his handling that issue, but I believe these are two men of integrity. I believe former Chief Justice Toll, a woman of integrity. We've again had many disagreements in the past, but there is nothing about this process that doesn't stink. There's nothing about this process that is fair, that is independent. And once again, we are going back to the most significant verdicts in South Carolina jurisprudence. This was the trial of the century. It was one that the state had to get right. If you follow this site, you know that we have spent years focusing on judicial corruption, on exposing it. The Murdaughs were a huge part of that, as a matter of fact. And by the way, where is the accountability for the judges they were corrupt with? Where'd that go? Well, we're one of the only outlets that's still on that case. But I want to talk a little bit more about this process because no matter what you think of Alec Murdaugh, and I think the guy is a POS who is absolutely where he belongs. I think he's a murderer who, if he didn't kill his wife and kid, participated in it or is covering up knowledge of who did. That's what I believe. If I were on the jury, I would have voted him guilty. I believe the jury got it right. I believe he is where he should be. I don't believe he should ever, again, according to some of these attorneys that have, become household names in this trial, I don't believe he should breathe free air again based on what he's already been convicted of. Not just in the murder case, but other cases. But here's the caveat to that. Whatever you think of him, however terrible he is, however much he deserved the verdict he got, and however accurate and just and correct that verdict is, if it was obtained under false pretenses, if it was obtained in a manner that violated his Sixth Amendment rights, if there was tampering, and if there now is an effort institutionally to cover up that tampering, then we are dealing with a problem in our court system that is even worse than anything we have covered in the past. South Carolina had to get this case right. It has to get it right moving forward. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you this. What I've seen, based on former Chief Justice Toll's rulings, in fact, she hinted at this during the court hearing on Friday. She hinted that she knew this case would be appealed and that she welcomed that. But I'm going to tell you right now, based on some of her rulings on these court cases, federal versus state, Green versus Remmer, there is a very likely chance that if the state does not order a new trial for Alec Murdaugh, he's going to get one from the feds. At some point, we're going to have to do this over again because the rules were not followed. And again, set aside anything you think about anyone involved in this case. It's difficult to do. It's difficult to do with Alec Murdaugh. It's even more difficult to do with Becky Hill, somebody who everybody in this process loved, someone who was helpful to everybody, a little too helpful, it appears. But it's not easy to do that. And it's not easy to call out some of the people who are overtly pushing agendas on this and conspiring to uphold this verdict. Folks, this verdict was not obtained properly. It is becoming clearer every day. And even worse, it is becoming clearer that there is an organized effort to protect that verdict at all costs. And that is not what our system is about. That is not what our system is about. That is not justice. And I hate being put in the position of having to be perceived as a defender of Alec Murdaugh or his side of this. There are no sides. The only side of this should be the side of truth and the side of right and the side of following the most simple processes here. Just don't talk to the jurors about the case. Or if there's evidence, investigate it properly and fairly. That's not happening. There's a full-scale push, a full court press, to protect this verdict and shut this all down. Our media outlet has been at the very front of this story, the forefront of this story from the very beginning. As I mentioned earlier, we have followed every twist, every turn. We've called it straight at every point along the way. We will continue to do so. Whether it's a popular take, whether it's an unpopular take, that's the job. But you will always get from this media outlet the truth and our best conception, our best abilities devoted to uncovering it, analyzing it, and putting it out for you. And again, in keeping with that, I want to remind everybody, as soon as we are able to publish the information from Friday's hearing, yesterday's hearing in Richland County, we will publish that. But we are going to abide by former Chief Justice Toll's embargo until Monday. But also, I want you to make sure, tune in tomorrow night. We're going to answer all the questions. You probably got a lot of questions after this. This was a crazy week in this story. And we're going to be here to answer them right here, 6 o'clock tomorrow night, a live Q&A where we will be recapping all of this Murdaugh madness as we look forward to Monday's big evidentiary hearing. All right, so we talked in the last section about judicial integrity in South Carolina. It's something this media outlet has been focused on for a long time. And there's a simple reason for that, people. Justice should be based on facts and truth. It shouldn't be based on which attorney appointed the judges, which attorney sets the salaries for the judges, which attorney set the budgets for the judicial branch. No, it should be based on fairness and fundamental truth. We don't have that in South Carolina. We haven't had that for a long time. And in fact, as we're seeing in this post-Murdaugh trial environment, we didn't really see it in the Murdaugh trial either. We thought that was the shining example of South Carolina getting it right. But the more we look at that verdict, the more we look at that case, the more disturbing it is. But pivoting back to all the other cases, because there's a ton of cases where judges in South Carolina have gotten it terribly wrong with tragic consequences for public safety, for victims. So many cases. There is one lawmaker who is standing up against that process. Back in October, this news outlet filed an exclusive report that State Senator Wes Clymer, a Republican from York County, South Carolina, had plans to filibuster judicial nominations until members of the South Carolina General Assembly passed a judicial reform bill. Now, a lot of folks read that story, may have read it in one ear, out the other, may have forgotten about it, but there was a little line in that story that I thought was very significant. It referenced Senator Clymer speaking to his colleagues to gather support for his efforts. Well, guess what? The good senator from York has some support. Senator Clymer filed a resolution just this past week to amend the judicial election process to only consider one race, the vacant Supreme Court Chief Justice seat that's about to come vacant here later this year. Justice Donald Beatty is stepping down. If you're a fan of real justice in South Carolina, that will please you. He's going to be replaced by, we believe, current Justice John Kittredge. But that process is the only election that Wes Clymer is going to allow. And guess what, folks? He has got 23 sponsors of his resolution. Folks, last time I did the math on how to stop a filibuster in South Carolina, you need more than 24 votes. And Senator Clymer's got himself and 23 friends who are saying, you know what? We are going to hold this up. Now, again, will all of them stick with Senator Clymer through the end? We will have to wait and see. But this was a huge shot across the bow of the corrupt uniparty status quo in Columbia, South Carolina, the same status quo that has been tolerating this corrupt judicial selection process for years. It's also an example of an elected official doing what they say they're going to do. So hats off to Senator Wes Clymer for being good to his word, for standing up against judicial corruption, for demanding that lawmakers first reform their broken process before they elect any new judges. And again, if you haven't been following FITSNews this month, judicial corruption is alive and well at the South Carolina State House. We exclusively reported on a qualified black judge who was forced out of the race to make way for an ex-politician, again, far less qualified, but they pushed this qualified black candidate out of the race. Not just Republicans doing this either, folks. There are Democrats joining this because the politician they're appointing or trying to appoint to this judicial post is the former Democratic minority leader. Once again, installing cronies over qualified candidates through corrupt means. That is exactly what we've been fighting against for years at this website, but par for the course here at the South Carolina General Assembly. But thank you to Senator Wes Clymer and all of the 23 senators who are standing with him. Some big names on there. Senate Finance Chairman Harvey Peeler's on that list. Tom Davis down in Beaufort County. A bunch of good folks on that list. I hope other senators join that list because, folks, we cannot continue to let this corrupt process pick our judges. It must be radically reformed. And again, there's a lot of proposals out there. We're going to continue to focus on that debate as it moves forward. But one thing is clear, no more judicial elections until this broken process is fixed. All right, so one of my favorite segments of this show over the last few weeks is Talking Politics with Dylan Nolan, our Director of Special Projects. Although I don't want to like it too much because your predictions are getting pretty good, Dylan. I mean, it's like I'm going to be looking for a job. Your crystal ball has been better than mine over the last couple of weeks, man.
Well, you got a pretty good crystal ball yourself.
Hey-oh. Let's walk through these last couple weeks on the campaign trail. The first in the South presidential primary that some had projected could be high noon. You projected would be a non-event, and guess what? You were right. Let's walk through that process, though. Nikki Haley, former South Carolina governor, some had suggested that a second-place showing in Iowa, followed by potentially first-place showing in New Hampshire, which could have been on the table, depending how certain dominoes fell, would set South Carolina up as where this race would be decided. But, Dylan, the race is already decided, isn't it?
Yeah, Donald Trump had strong showings in both Iowa and New Hampshire in his polling. Somewhere between, I mean, we haven't had a national poll here in South Carolina in a while, so it's hard to put an exact number on it, but I would guess conservatively 25 points ahead.
Yeah, even if you look at Trump's internal polling, or rather the polling put out by his pollster, he's up by 40 in South Carolina, 68 to 28, I believe, if my South Carolina math checks out.
That's pretty extreme. I'm sure that our political columnist Mark Powell is getting tired of these primary Trump victory speech, Haley also victory speech write-ups. But do you think we're going to see another one of those here?
Well, Haley has said that she is in the race through Super Tuesday. That has been where she has come down on this. Obviously, some of the money backing her has begun to dry up. Some of the liberal billionaire LinkedIn money.
Reid Hoffman, yeah, he's out.
No longer in play for her. How long do you think, Dylan, that Nikki Haley can stay in based on, again, this evaporation of financial support, evaporation of popular support, and obviously the indignity of coming to her home state and getting what appears to be routed?
Well, it's interesting because before New Hampshire, a state that she was looking like she was going to lose, going into election night, she said that there are dozens of states left. So if that's what she's thinking, then I think she's going to be in this for the long haul, hoping for indictment, hoping for Donald Trump to have a stroke or some other event, maybe a brokered convention. But I think that she's going to be in this for longer than a traditional candidate in any other election cycle would.
Well, she is picking up delegates. Let's go ahead and point that out.
Right.
That a lot of people assume that this is a democratic process. It's a delegate-based process. In South Carolina, however, the delegate count works a little bit differently. 29 of the delegates, the 50 delegates that South Carolina awards, they're based on whoever wins the popular vote in the state. The other 21, they're broken down by congressional district. And I don't see a congressional district that Donald Trump's going to lose to Nikki Haley. Do you?
You are probably more read into this than I am, but I would agree.
Yeah, so 50 to nothing would be the likely the delegate vote score here in South Carolina. But Dylan, you just raised an interesting point, brokered convention. And one of the things that I kept in my mind as I was writing a big story this week on sort of the evolution of how Haley went from potential contender to clear second place finisher, something that you said had stuck in my mind about how the only way that Haley gets this nomination is through some sort of chicanery at the convention, something extra electoral. What do you
I believe last week I used the verb weasel, and, obviously that imparts some of my opinion of the process, but obviously, that's behind-the-scenes maneuvering among the party elite to secure her nomination. And, we could see Donald Trump, a convicted felon, come the convention So it would be interesting to see, could he win a presidential race with an ankle bracelet on?
Well, Trump's hold on South Carolina obviously was very strong. Back in January of last year, Trump held a huge event at the South Carolina State House, unveiling a host of big endorsements. A lot of them were folks that we knew would be on his team, but it was still a real show of force. And then prior to the New Hampshire race, another show of South Carolina statewide endorsements. And then obviously Tim Scott coming on board, Nancy Mace coming on board. And those were two people, Dylan. A lot of folks expected them to gravitate toward Haley. I mean, after all, Nikki Haley is the one who appointed Tim Scott to the U.S. Senate, launched him on his national career, if you will. And then Nancy Mace was actually targeted for defeat by Trump in 2022. Nikki Haley comes to her rescue. Now Mace endorses Trump over Haley.
Politics is a brutal game, isn't it?
Well, those two endorsements and many others obviously solidifying Donald Trump's firewall here in South Carolina. But let's look past the first in the South. Let's look past Super Tuesday. Let's assume that Trump runs the delegate count up, as we expect he will. Then let's assume there's an indictment. Let's assume there's a push to engineer a ticket outside of the GOP electorate. What happens then? What do you envision, assuming Trump is removed from the Republican ballot, which is a possibility? What happens then?
Well, you were speaking earlier about my my accurate crystal ball earlier in the segment, and I think my crystal ball is pretty good because in a situation like this where there are so many variables, where there's no precedent in history, I decline to make a prediction. I think that things could get certainly very tense in this country. I mean, I don't think that takes a real genius to predict, because I think there would be millions of people who would feel completely disenfranchised and people who have felt completely disenfranchised since around 2016. So I don't know. I hope that things don't go that way. I hope that, win, lose, or draw, this process is something that the majority of Americans feels democratic and representative of their true will.
Well, let's flip it back to a prediction you did make that is holding up, which is that Biden is not going to be the establishment, uniparty, deep state, whatever term you want to throw on it, swamp. He's not going to be their choice. You've been pointing that out for several months now. A lot of folks predicted that, if the Democrats couldn't find a successor to Biden, they might try to work within the Republican primary. Clearly, Nikki would have been that Trojan horse. But where do you see the Biden calculus falling now that we are, again, very close to these conventions this summer?
Well, I'm sure that you've seen the reports, the Washington, D.C. insider reports that Barack Obama's been working the phones with the top brass over at the Democratic Party, advocating for his wife, Michelle Obama, to potentially take a run here. So, we talk about brokered conventions on the Republican side. We could also see the exact same thing with Joe Biden stepping down. I think that obviously for his presidency to have any weight, for him to be able to carry out his agenda, he needs to obviously act like he's going to run for as long as possible. But I don't know if you saw, he went out and did some event this week where he was with the union guys, and he was standing there with a hard hat on backwards during this photo shoot. It was just completely symbolic of where his mind's at these days. And I just don't think that he's got it in him to run again. And you see the polling, so the Democrats would be insane to let that happen. Gavin Newsom, somebody who's been floated. He's somebody who barnstormed South Carolina literally this week, going to all of the cities that you would typically go to as a candidate, to try to engender primary support. But I think that Michelle Obama would be a more compelling candidate because she's a woman, because she's somebody that everybody in the nation already likes. I think the First Lady is somebody that you get a popularity boost because it's not a controversial position, like somebody who's actually in the arena throwing bombs. So I think that she would be in a really good position to take down whoever the Republicans end up nominating. So it will be very interesting to see if she gets last minute swapped in there.
Whoever the Republicans end up nominating, that's an interesting turn of phrase, considering we are looking at a GOP electorate that has clearly, for better or worse,
they've signaled who they want. And it's very interesting to me. I was looking at the AP, watching the AP results for New Hampshire, just had it up on my television throughout the night. And the AP said, here's why we're not going to use the term presumptive nominee this cycle. So they're going to wait until somebody is quite literally the nominee of the party to say that. Because I think that there is this push, and by the way, the Wall Street Journal editorial board the next morning kind of put out a big piece along the same lines, to leave the door open for as long as possible for, anything could happen to swap who gets that Republican nomination.
Yeah, well, he's clearly the presumptive nominee, and in fact, we've been calling him that for months. There was a brief moment there, early January, we referred to him as the front runner, or I did anyway. I won't throw this on you. I fell for it, not you. But I wanted to also walk through, we did this big piece, or I did this big piece this week, and it walked through sort of the evolution of those 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of January, where Haley really had the makings of a path, and it all kind of fell apart. And the first thing that I pointed to, January 3rd, in New Hampshire, she gives a speech talking about how Iowa votes, then New Hampshire corrects it. And this was just a really, it was a joke. It was obvious she was joking. But, the governor of Iowa quickly comes out with a tweet that says, hey, we don't need correcting. Ron DeSantis jumps on it and says, hey, Haley's insulting Iowa voters. And all of a sudden it's a thing. Then a week later, you've got Chris Christie's hot mic moment where he says that Haley is going to get smoked and is not up for it. And this is someone who was widely believed to be a likely big endorsement for Haley, potentially an endorsement propelling her. I mean, he was polling at 11% in New Hampshire. That could have been big. So those were sort of the dominoes that I was looking at, but Nikki kind of sabotaged them with the Iowa gaffe. Chris Christie's hot mic further complicated the situation. But you were never sold that that path was there, were you, Dylan?
Yeah, I actually read an article this morning that I think is really insightful. Do you mind if I read a passage of it to you and then maybe we discuss it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is Ed Kilgore from The Intelligencer writing, in 2010, Haley was the candidate of the hardcore Tea Party conservatives in what might be called the Jim DeMint, Mark Sanford wing of the GOP. Systematic ideologues often at odds with former Dixiecrats who were slowly dying out but still had some serious clout. Sanford's bizarre 2009 extramarital affair conducted under the guise of hiking the Appalachian Trail made him damaged goods in 2010. But his estranged wife Jenny was still an important force behind Haley's ascent. Her real stroke of luck, however, was becoming the very favorite candidate of then red-hot right-wing folk heroine Sarah Palin, the veritable queen of the Tea Party who designated Haley a fellow Mama Grizzly, as the Washington Post recently recalled. You cite all of these minor transgressions, Chris Christie having a hot mic moment, her insulting the people of Iowa, but I would argue that her candidacy never had any wind in the sails because she completely forgot what it was that made her a candidate in the first place, which was her association with ideas that were worthwhile.
Well, you're right. And it's also interesting you were bringing all those things up from Mr. Kilgore's article. All that stuff FITSNews covered in real time as it happened. And so very familiar with Haley's ideological betrayals as governor of South Carolina. She flip-flopped long before becoming a national candidate. Again, as you correctly pointed out, she was the Tea Party candidate in 2010. She promised to govern as a fiscal conservative. Instead, crony capitalism exploded under her watch. Government spending exploded under her watch. She did not lift a finger with her budget veto to stop it. So Nikki Haley, hardly a fiscal conservative as governor of South Carolina, and certainly betrayed the Tea Party ideals that she campaigned on. But putting all that to the side, looking at where this race could have gone, do you not agree that if Haley finishes a strong second in Iowa, that gets a Chris Christie endorsement in New Hampshire, where, by the way, in early January, she's polling single digits behind Donald Trump, does not that not put New Hampshire in play for her?
I mean, could have, would have, should have, but how is she going to do these things when she's completely ideologically misaligned with the base of the party?
Fair enough. Did get 40+% in New Hampshire, though. We'll throw that out there. But for whatever we think about past polling numbers, past paths, potential paths, the race as it stands now is over, barring, as you mentioned, some convention chicanery. But Dylan, how troubling is this? We're in a situation where the Republican electorate is clearly speaking in a very clear voice. The Democratic electorate, for better or worse, in New Hampshire, even with Joe Biden's name not on the ballot because of his hijinks with reordering the party structure and reordering the primary calendar, they still wrote him in by overwhelming margins. So the Democratic voters also will have a chance to speak in South Carolina here in the next few days. How do we then go to these conventions and overturn the will of the people?
Well, I think it's going to be different on the Democratic side because Joe Biden is going to willingly step down. If something happens on the Republican side, it's going to be, barnstorming by force.
That's your predict Biden will voluntarily step down before the...
Well, I'm not saying that he will, but I'm saying that if there is a swapperoo in the Democrat Party, everybody's going to have a sigh of relief. Whereas if that happens on the Republican side, it's only going to ratchet up the tension.
Well, Dylan, you said it, unprecedented, and so far, again, your predictions faring a good bit better than mine on this thing. So I don't know, you may be doing this for a living.
Hopefully, for a good long while. I'm having fun.
Absolutely. South Carolina's first in the South Democratic primary coming up here on February the 4th. South Carolina's first in the South Republican primary coming up February 24th. Keep it tuned to FITSNews for the very latest on both of those races. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition. I want to thank Dylan Nolan for coming in here with me and talking politics. Again, don't forget, tomorrow night, 6 p.m. live right here. FITSNews will be hosting a Q&A. It'll be me. It'll be our research director, Jen Wood, Dylan Nolan, the whole team here, bringing you the very latest and answering your questions on the eve of Alec Murdaugh's bid for a new trial. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.